Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Nadira Hira, and it's been my absolute pleasure to be your MC in the 2021 SDG Action Zone. On the heels of 2 packed days reimagining issues of poverty and inequalities and gender equality, we're in our final stretch now. And today it's about the climate emergency. Because no matter what else we're able to achieve, none of it will matter if we can't save the planet. Here to help us begin, painting climate change as it is, rather than how we want it to be, is an award-winning poet, teaching artist, mental health educator, and community leader who's spoken everywhere from Barack Obama's White House to the UN Conference on Climate Change in Paris. Welcome, Teresa Sagatonu.
Salafalava, hello. I'm so excited to be with you all, opening up day 3 of the 2021 SDG Action Zone. I offer you this poem as a way to guide your time today with each other as you're talking about critical issues regarding climate action. And I offer it as a way to remind us that art is the soul of our communities. And art helps us to articulate that which we can't always articulate through other mediums. So without further ado, here we go. I don't know much about how to talk about climate change, but I do know a thing or two about water. I know that San Francisco, city of my birth, was running out of it, as if the state of California was losing its memory of what lakes look like because not enough rain had fallen to replenish them. I know that my island of Samoa is thriving off of the very thing that plans to kill it once the sea levels are too high to distinguish the difference between swimming and drowning. I know that the tsunami spared my grandpa's home back in September of 2009, but took 200 others. How no one in my family ever dared to call that a blessing. I don't always know how to talk about the impacts of fossil fuels or carbon footprints, but I do know a hell of a lot about poverty and the paradoxes of being poor. How saving the environment rarely means saving those who come from environments like mine, where Black and brown bodies are riddled with despair, too worried about going broke to even worry about going green, losing their will to fight the foreclosure signs, sprouting under blocks like redwoods, worried about how to make a dollar stretch with dignity to even worry about saving anybody else but themselves, and I can't blame them. According to a poll that I read, most Americans know that the climate is changing, but they say that they're just not that worried about it. They say that it's too distant for them to care about it right now. Too big, too abstract, too rich to care about it affecting them, too poor to prioritize caring about how it affects them. Climate change isn't always something that I feel confident talking about, but I know what it's like to watch Mother Nature, watch other mothers grieving in the streets as their child's Black or brown body decomposes on hot gravel at the feet of police brutality, in the face of an iPhone camera. Watch the rest of the world watch our extinction go viral. Another version of an inconvenient truth. Call this a debate if you want. Call this a left-wing liberal protest cry all you want, but this is what I know about climate change. I know the academics who take my community's pain and turn it into a grant proposal without our permission, the journalists who take my community's grief and use it as a fear tactic. I know the price of greed and the people who have to pay for it a third world away. I know how to trace the puppet strings back to the corporations who hold the world's wealth for hostage in their back pockets, while the rest of us spend our lives paying for the gun. I know what it's like to come from the most powerful country on the planet, forever pregnant off of its own power. There are those who want to talk about climate change, yet don't want to talk about how those who are affected the most can't prioritize it in the first place. Because prioritizing it would mean being forced to pull the layers back and also talk about the poverty, the racism, the injustice, the privilege, the hush money, the hit list that climate change is operating from, the rounds it makes on Earth, starting with the most vulnerable. Everyone wants to talk about climate change and how it's impacting everybody, but sometimes it impacts some communities first. This is for those of us who may never read the reports, who may never have all the data, but who still have a voice. This is for those of us who can't afford to pay rent, but who also can't afford to wait. This is for those of us who are ready to act, even if it means doing it for someone we'll never know, on the other side of the world, in a place we didn't even know existed. There are those of us who are talking about climate change, and then there are those of us who are fighting it. This is for those of us who has always had to figure out a way to do both.
Just wow. Thank you, Teresa, for that vulnerability, for feeling frustrated and fighting anyway. The science is unequivocal. Climate change is man-made, and we have pushed beyond our planetary boundaries. We've taken more from our planet than it can provide, and in every corner of the world, we are facing the dire consequences. Perhaps you've seen headlines about the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In it, more than 200 scientists around the world called this moment a code red for humanity. There is no debate, no room to equivocate or wonder if climate change will really affect you, your neighbors, or your country. It will. It already is. We are facing an existential threat. We need a dramatic transformation to face down the deep ecological crises we're in, starting immediately. This moment demands a new way of thinking, a new relationship with the planet and each other as we look to 2030. But don't lose heart or hope. It's clear this essential mindset shift is already underway in many places, especially for the next generation, who are hitting the streets around the world right now and using their voices, votes, and wallets to advocate and agitate for change. That ambition is our starting place for this third and final day of the SDG Action Zone. To understand what needs to happen at the global, regional, and local levels, what we all need to do to stave off the worst of global warming. Over the course of the day, we'll envision a truly circular economy with an award-winning designer. Delve into real-time city adaptation efforts with local government leaders in Freetown and Paris. Create a roadmap to clean energy with the head of the African Development Bank, and so much more. And we'll have a special one-on-one sit-down with UN Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed on keeping the promise of the SDGs. Then we'll cap the program with a musical performance from four-time Grammy winner Angelique Kidjo that I know will leave you feeling renewed and ready to fight for people and for planet. But remember, we genuinely want this to be a two-way dialogue. So please keep posting your thoughts and questions. Be sure to use hashtag SDG Action Zone 2021 and hashtag for People for Planet. And if you'd like to pose a question for our final Ask Away session later today, and we hope you will, just send it to us via the virtual platform. Speaking of, the virtual platform has some great resources if you want to know what's coming up, or even what you missed. Check out the Program tab up top for a downloadable agenda. And the on-demand section has all our SDG Action Zone content available to watch, rewatch, and share. All to say, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get to it. I'll see you on the other side for our first conversation of the day. Well, it's time to settle in now for a fireside chat. We're less than 40 days away from COP26, which, of course, is the global summit uniting world leaders around the more ambitious and aggressive climate action. Or at least that's the hope. So we want to use these next few minutes to have a candid conversation about what's at stake and what's possible. And we're going to do it with two deeply thoughtful women leaders. First, we're so lucky to have the UN's climate chief, who played a key role in climate negotiations in Mexico during COP16, and is now, 10 years later, calling on everyone everywhere to act urgently and with even greater ambition. Welcome, Patricia Espinosa Cantellano. And then there's a young activist who at just 15 years old was inspired by the impact of hurricanes and wildfires in the US to found the youth climate action organization 0 Hour. Welcome, Jamie Margolin. So Patricia, Jamie, we're so happy to have you with us. And I thought we'd just start with maybe the obvious question. What does success look like for you at COP26 in Glasgow? Patricia, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you very much. And thank you for this invitation to participate in such a conversation just 6 weeks before the conference. It's 6 weeks. If you imagine we have not been able to meet in almost 2 years, it's really, really a very, very important moment. First of all, what does success look like? First of all, I would like to underline, we need to move from discussions about how the Paris Agreement works to fully implement that agreement in the countries. And we also need to stop talking about how the most vulnerable countries will be supported to exactly having plans on the support that is needed for those very vulnerable countries. The outcome, in order for us to really be able to have a success, is not about 1, 2, or 3 decisions. It is really about a series of decisions, resolutions, but also actions that will allow us to give a big message to the world that the 1.5-degree goal under the Paris Agreement and that the resilient, more healthy, and a better future for everyone is still within our grip. And for that, we need, I normally refer to 4 points. Let me try to be very, very short. First,
we appreciate it.
we need to see that the promises that were made are fulfilled. And one of them has to do with the mobilization of finance, the 100 billion that was agreed actually in Cancun. The formal agreement was in Cancun. Second, we need to wrap up the negotiations so that the Paris Agreement can be fully implemented. Third, we need to see parties raising their ambitions in mitigation, in adaptation, and in finance. And we must have an inclusive conference. That means that we need to have all of you, everyone participating in one way or another. Everyone has a role to play. I think I would leave it at that.
I almost see the word action just, in neon lights above your head. And we hear you and we agree. Jamie, I'd love for you to jump in here and tell us what success looks like for you.
I mean, success looks like listening to the needs of communities and the people instead of the needs of the fossil fuel industry. Unfortunately, fossil fuel industries participate and help fund COP. And a lot of the times their influence is massive and they end up controlling what happens if their voices are the ones that are prioritized. We need to get polluters out of COP and we need to focus on the voices of communities, of people on the front lines, of Indigenous folks, of those who are feeling the worst effects of the climate crisis, and divest everything from the fossil fuel industry. We need to divest our entire society from the fossil fuel industry. That means divesting universities. Harvard University just announced its divestment from fossil fuel, which is great. That also means entire countries need to divest from fossil fuels, base our economies on a renewable energy and clean energy, sustainable economy instead of the fossil fuel economy. And that transition needs to happen immediately. And so that is really what is necessary. And so at COP, my biggest hope for COP and for all the people there is that the needs of communities and people are met, not the needs of polluters, and that we get them out of these conferences and instead focus on those on the front lines, and instead focus on the fact that here in New York City, there is a countdown clock in Union Square Park that is right now that says we have a little over 6 years to act on the climate crisis. 6 years. I'm 19 years old right now. In 6 years, I'm not really good at math, but I'll still be in my 20s. So the world is, according to science, life as we know it, society, the climate crisis tipping point is happening in my 20s. And there are millions of babies being born right now, and people are still being born, and there are people younger than me, and we have a whole generation that's growing up into this world that is so uncertain and so scary, and we have a whole generation growing up with intense climate depression and anxiety. And so what we need from COP and what we need from our leaders is not just talk, is not just, oh, look at us, we care about the environment, and then going behind the scenes and continuing to put polluters first, continuing to harm Indigenous people. We need actual action, and we need to see what is spoken about being implemented.
action, again, is the big headline there. So I want to encourage us to keep our responses short because, of course, we're tight on time and I want to hear so much more from both of you. We are really, and Patricia, you touched upon this, in a moment where we need to accelerate because the clock is ticking and we didn't have a COP last year for obvious reasons. So if you had to think about one thing that could help us to accelerate towards, again, this, what we hope is achievable goal of at least arresting climate change, what would that be? What is the one mechanism that you can point to right now that can help us accelerate this movement? Patricia, go ahead. I see you getting excited.
Yes. Well, under the Paris Agreement, countries need to present their national climate plans. And those climate plans need to have very clear commitments on what are the pledges of the country. So the IPCC, on the other hand, is telling us that we need a reduction in emissions of 45% by 2030, and that we need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So if we were able to get everybody, all countries, commit to those two goals that are clearly established by science, that would mean that we are on the safe side. Now, it may not be possible to have it immediately, but at least to have a plan, to have a clear plan so that we know we are going in the right direction. And as Jamie has said, yes, it is true. We really have no time to lose. So the time to take those decisions is now.
Mm-hmm. And it is very much a shoot for the moon, reach the stars kind of situation, or whatever the proper space analogy is, where just because we can't do it right away doesn't mean that we shouldn't aim for that. Jamie, what about you? What's one thing that we can do to accelerate?
One thing that we can do to accelerate, and I'm just going to keep emphasizing this because this is what all governments need to do and everyone needs to do, is divest. Get the fossil fuel industry and their money out of everything. Get it out of the universities, get it out of your countries, get it out of COP and the COP26. There are fossil fuel funders for these conferences. Get the polluters out. That is there's an organization started by a lot of my great friends called Polluters Out that is really focusing on this. But I really think that the first step to getting a whole is to stop digging and to stop centering the voices of those causing the problem. Albert Einstein defined insanity as trying to solve a problem with the same thinking or the same rationale that caused it. And so those who perpetuate the climate crisis and cause it do not have the solutions. That's why it's important that in order to accelerate climate action, we divest our governments, COP, everything from the fossil fuel industry and listen to indigenous peoples who have been fighting for climate justice since before climate justice was a popular term.
What's one thing that gives you hope? Because I love everything that you both said, and we appreciate it deeply. We'd love to hear what keeps you in this fight and what keeps you excited about our progress. Jamie, why don't you start us on this one?
I'd say my fellow activists, and knowing that I have people of all ages in this global family that I'm fighting alongside with. I have, Patricia, myself, everyone, we're all a part of this big global climate action family and community. And knowing that this intergenerational, international family is something that I have and that we're in it together is really comforting and gives me a lot of hope.
It's wonderful. Patricia?
Of course, the energy and the commitment of so many people around the world, but also the fact that there are out there already very incredible solutions, not necessarily solutions that cost a lot of money, but I do believe that young people have a very special role to play. It is very much, as Jamie is saying, about their future. They are young now. They are looking at, okay, what is the world is going to look like when I grow up. So they do have a very, very special role to play.
I'd love to ask you actually to talk to each other for just a second, because Jamie, you're sitting here with a person who is a leader in this space and is in a lot of the conversations that matter, as hopefully you are and will continue to be as well. And if you could say something to her, to Patricia, about what you hope, what you want, what you would like to see her champion on your behalf and on behalf of all people in the entire planet, what would that be? What's the thing you would love to say to her? Because she's sitting here with you in this great conversation.
Well, I think the thing that I would love to say to you is that there has to be a global movement to defend the defenders. I'm Colombian. You can see the group of Colombian flags. My family's from Colombia. There is such a high rate of murders of environmental activists there and all around the world. And so I would love to see also commitments regarding defending the defenders, especially Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women who are murdered for the work that they do. And so what I would like to see and what I would love to see you champion is having some sort of international agreement or continuing to fight to defend the defenders.
And for those who don't know, that is a very real issue. We saw studies that say last year was the most dangerous year for defenders, where the most folks in that category of environmental defender were actually murdered. So that is a real issue and one that we are going to need to keep a huge focus on if we're going to make any progress. Patricia, what about you? What would you say to Jamie and to young activists like her in terms of what they can do to help you advance the fight beyond what they've already done, which obviously is compelling and is dramatically pushing us forward?
I would say to them, please do not get discouraged. It's very difficult, but do not get discouraged. That's the only thing we cannot do. There's lots of things that we can do together. I would also say use the tools that you have in your hands to change the way things are evolving. One of them is, of course, the participation in the decisions on who is going to lead in your country, the members of parliament, the people in the executive, who are going to be there. Use your vote, use your voice in order to get as many people as possible supporting these causes. We need that kind of leadership, and that is what is going to drive this transformation.
If you haven't tweeted yet, folks, please tweet. That is the only thing we cannot do, is get discouraged, is give up. I love it. And I'm just going to take 10 seconds to ask you both to give us one call to action for our participants watching today. Quick as you can, what's one thing that comes to mind that everybody watching today can do to fight climate change and ultimately stop it? Patricia, you first.
Invest your money in the right way, which means invest in places that are not supporting highly polluting industries.
Jamie, last word to you.
Donate to Indigenous organizations and Indigenous people on the front lines.
And with that, thank you to Patricia and to Jamie. This was an incredible conversation and it gives me hope. So thank you for that. And thank you for being with us here in the 2021 SDG Action Zone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Now let's take a step back and look at the big picture. From the latest UN climate report to the seemingly endless string of climate crises facing the most vulnerable communities, experts agree 2021 is the make or break year for climate. And if you're watching this live today, let me assure you it's not too late to save the planet. It's not too late to restore our balance with nature. Not too late to tackle the climate emergency, not too late to protect food systems. And it's definitely not too late to do all of this while ensuring no one is left behind. But we need big, bold transformation at all levels, and we need it urgently. We need the same energy and drive that made the impossible possible in the face of a global pandemic, a health emergency, to see us through this clear and present climate emergency. Because truly, we are in the red zone. The three courageous climate leaders joining us today embody that urgency, leading through action and mobilizing others to go beyond rhetoric. Our first guest has been at the forefront of environmental innovation in Chile and even served as the first private sector climate champion on COP25. Welcome, Gonzalo Muno. Then we have an incredibly impressive activist who's also our youngest panelist. The UN Secretary General took notice of his work mobilizing communities in the Pacific Islands around climate science, and last year invited him to join the SG's Youth Advisory Group. Hello, Ernest Gibson. And last but not least, we are so pleased to be joined by the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone's capital and largest city, whose Transform Freetown initiative serves as a powerful model for ambitious, inclusive, and green urban transformation. Welcome, Yvonne Denise Aki-Sawyer. We are so happy to have all of you with us. And the fact is, you're all doing incredible change-making work. So why don't we start there? Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing on the climate action front. And Gonzalo, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks so much, Nadira, and great to be with all of you in this panel. First, I think that it's important to recognize what we have heard from science in the last period of time. As you mentioned, the latest IPCC report absolutely reinforced that climate crisis is the biggest threat for humanity. It also warns that the effect to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will be beyond reach in the next decade without immediate, rapid, and large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. In that sense, we need to act very rapidly. We are mobilizing with my dear friend Nigel Topping as the two high-level climate action champions for COP, all non-state actors, meaning businesses, investors, civil society, universities, all of us, to really work towards that window of opportunity that we have to reach the 1.5 degrees immediately, I mean, in the very short period of time.
So it's recognizing the urgency and broadening the scope. I love to hear it. Ernest, what about you?
Thanks, Nadira. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think a lot of the work that I do really revolves around community engagement and finding ways of ensuring that communities, and in particular Indigenous communities, have an opportunity to really have a change-driving role in their own developmental processes. One thing that I think is really important to remember is that Indigenous communities have had a much better track record of working with the environment and developing a relationship with the environment than we've had in some of the more developmental spaces. And so it's really finding a way of, harnessing the richness and depth of knowledge and the relationship that communities have, and using that as the basis for decisions that are taken in a development space. And so I think it's really recognizing the importance of communities and Indigenous communities, as well as the agency that they hold, and finding a way of really highlighting this and ensuring that that becomes the frame at which we solve the climate crisis. For too long, I think we've done this very dangerous top-down approach. It's now a time to really turn around our community engagement practices and use that as a means of doing it very circularly, in a way that really benefits the broader segment of society.
Absolutely. Carry on.
No, I was just going to say, I think that it's something that a lot of people have heard me harp on about. But until and unless I see some sort of substantive change in that area, I'm not going to stop.
You should do the harping. I was just going to harp on your behalf a tiny bit more to say that I love that we are framing this so differently. It's constantly been about letting Indigenous communities be involved, and rather it should be about them leading the charge, because they do have the best track record, as you say. And last but not least, Mayor, we teased a little bit of what you've been up to, but we'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your work, and specifically this powerful force for climate action that you and your city have become.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So Transform Freetown is an integrated approach to urban development, and addressing 11 sectors, but starting off with environmental management right at the heart, at the top of this. But I think one of the key features of Transform Freetown is the recognition of the interconnectedness, that climate change affects people's lives, that the sanitation affects climate change, and sanitation affects health, and economic empowerment, creating jobs, is impacted by climate change. But at the same time, we can actually work on an adaptation and climate mitigation strategies, which themselves are creating jobs. So whether it's creating jobs in sanitation with the tricycle groups, bringing it down to the micro level, working in communities, whether it's through planting trees, where you're not just planting the trees, but you're growing the trees, and communities are taking the lead on that, whether it's strengthening communities' ability to deal with risk mitigation. So there was a terrible storm last night, and we're sending messages out to our community disaster risk management team saying, be on the ready. There's a plan. building those plans. So it's a combination of working in that's transformative, integrated approach, both to mitigate against climate change, but to also ensure that we're adapting, because sadly, climate change is already here. It's very real, as we all know. So we're doing two things at the same time, protecting and hopefully preventing.
Absolutely. And because we are truly in crisis, I have to say here that we're so lucky to even have you with us, Mayor, because of what you said happened last night. And sadly, that's such a relatable experience for all of us around the world. So it literally could not be more urgent. I kind of want to go around the horn a little bit more and drill down a bit. So Gonzalo, you're passionate about metrics and accountability. And I wonder what you think needs to happen to make these commitments to climate change that we consistently hear from countries, cities, corporations, whomever, a reality. How do we actually make that happen from conversation to movement and action?
Sure. Well, there are different layers for that question, because of course we know that this is a problem that is affecting all of us. While at the same time, it's affecting more those that have less responsibility on creating the problem. The capacity on mitigating the problem many times is, again, in the hands of the most powerful countries and organizations around the world. And we need to rely and we need to strengthen our capacity on working at a multilateral system and allowing that multilateralism to be much more inclusive, to have this voice of the citizens, of the indigenous populations, of the subnational governments, and also from the business and the financial sector. In a few weeks, in let's say 7 weeks, we will have this meeting in Glasgow where, again, we will be confronting a capacity of moving stronger and faster due to not only the reality of having received a dramatic report that activated this code, red code for the humanity, but also we've had events like the ones that Yvonne is now suffering in Freetown. We have like floods that batter Europe and China and India, wildfires in Canada, Greece, and Turkey. The impacts of climate change are one of the metrics that we need to take into consideration. And in that sense, we expect that we can move COP and use COP26 as a turning point towards implementation of the actions that are needed to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's not only about the national government, it's about what we do on a daily basis.
It's so funny, I'm saying absolutely constantly because I agree with everything that's being said here. But I have to say, it's so interesting hearing you talk about this, and I'd love to hear everyone's perspective, because the reality is those of us who have been paying attention to this, we get the metrics on the crisis side. We don't need any further data on that front. What are the metrics of accountability on the action side? What do we do to get these folks that you're talking about and that we're all listing, companies, countries, cities, to actually start to measure the impact that they're having and hopefully by extension commit to that impact even more?
Sure. So with my dear fellow champion and friend Nigel Topping, we have put together mostly 3 big campaigns. And those campaigns are not just are not communicational campaigns, are action-driven campaigns connected to what we need to solve. On one side, we have a mitigation campaign called Race to Zero, a race from the non-state actors to achieve a net zero world by 2050 at the very latest. And therefore, we need to follow the curve that science is giving us. We need to peak emissions in the next few years. We need to halve our emissions by 2030, and we need to reach net zero emissions at the maximum in 2050, at the same time as we stop destroying nature and we start restoring nature very rapidly. For all of that, we have metrics. We have what we call a 4P plan. You have to pledge, plan according to science, you have to proceed, and you have to publish at least every year. All of that is being measured not only by scientists, in this case, led by the University of Oxford, but also being shared by the global community. And in these days, we've just finished a consultation process for all of this to be credible and transparent in order to, again, manage the way to move faster towards the net zero world. But it's also about resilience. We've also managed to run the race to resilience for 4 billion people to increase their resilience in this decade in urban, rural, and coastal zones. And also our third campaign is about finance. We need to shift the conversation from the 100 billions to the trillions that are required to be deployed all around the world, but mostly in the global south, to really move forward with the need on implementing the actions that are required for the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement, and to again move us to the resilient and net zero world that we required in 2050 at the very latest.
Mayor, I want to toss you there because you're nodding your head as hard as I am. So I would love to hear you reflect on what Gonzalo's just said, and specifically that elevating up of the financials, but also you've been so successful in putting people at the center of this movement. And so it'd be wonderful to hear you reflect a little bit on that and how the two sort of interlock.
Okay, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the finance. With people at the center and no money, you still get nowhere. And I think this is the biggest, I think this is the biggest challenge we are facing. There has been a lot of rhetoric, but I can tell you that as a classic example, we started in 2018. I became mayor in 2018. By 2019 early, we were already working on a mass transit, green mass transit system, a cable car, which would significantly reduce our limited but important greenhouse gas emissions from the transport section. It would also increase productivity, and increasing productivity addresses so many other things, the financial resources in city to make other changes. 2 years down the line, we have yet to access funding for feasibility study. So I think there's a real gap between the rhetoric about access and availability of climate finance and global South cities being able to actually get hold of that. And until we close that, until that gap is bridged, we're going to continue to have situations where what's being said will be said, but it will never deliver the very urgent investments that we need. This is not about a talking show. This is not about going through processes where you're writing applications and waiting for 9 months. If there's a real urgency and there's an acceptance of that urgency, then we need to see a change in the mechanics, the mechanisms and the frameworks which enable access to climate finance. It's got to become a reality. There is so much that's said, it's not cutting it, because the experience of those of us on the ground is that finance is not as available in the sectors, it's not available in the timeframes, and significantly, many times, it's not directly available to subnational governments. You're having to jump through hoops with national governments, which can be very complicated. Where you've got
very discouraging.
Yeah, well,
incredibly discouraging.
If you've got different political parties, you automatically can find yourself in a situation where the level of cooperation and coordination that one would expect to see isn't there. And if what we care about is the results, then let's cut through that. Let's make sure we have a route for access to finance. And I will just say that, again, people need to be at the heart. As you said, we're really taking a people-centered approach, whether it's a cleaner zone competition, where you're getting communities to own, you're putting into the metrics for the competition elements of green, whether it's introducing recycling at the door as a new concept, composting, urban farming. All of this has people at the center, but to go to scale, both in a city and nationally, you're going to need a lot more resources than are currently available.
It could not be said better, honestly. We need more, and we need everybody to be focused on that, and we need to be doing the work to take the talking and the conversations into action. And the reality is, we saw in this last year and a half that it's possible. Everybody would be shocked 2 years ago to think of all the changes that we've made and everything that we've done in order to face this pandemic, and yet it's happened. So just as you say, it's about getting ourselves into the mindset of actually making the change. So Ernesto, I have to come to you because you talked passionately already about the most climate vulnerable communities and indigenous communities in particular. What do we need to do to reduce that existential threat that they are so clearly facing, and facing even sooner and before all the rest of the world is actually realizing how incredibly dangerous it is?
Yeah, I mean, Yvonne and Gonzalo were absolutely right when it comes to talking about financing. I think you can have all the goodwill and all the good intentions in the world, but if there's no money or resources to back your good intentions, then unfortunately things fall flat. And I think my favorite way of describing this is just by asking the question, WTF, where's the finance? Because I mean, that's the question that we need to continually be asking. Where is it going? Who is influencing where these are going? Because unfortunately, I mean, you talked about, Yvonne, how often funds are not reaching sub-national level. Just imagine how difficult it is for it to reach grassroots level. Imagine adding on to that the difficulties that are involved or associated once you involve regional institutions. And the way it works in a lot of parts of the world is that a lot of the climate financing gets tied up in the red tape and the bureaucracy of regional institutions. And the more layers that you put between the funding sources and the funding recipients, unfortunately means that there is so much more that is lost. And so, I mean, people talk about trickle-down economics, but we know that that's like probably one of the biggest cons in the world, right? It's never going to make it down to the communities. And I think that there are two really important things that I wanted to talk about. And one of them is ambition, and the other one is a just recovery. I grew up, I think, in a slightly strange, a little bit eccentric family where dinner table conversation was always around climate crisis or socioeconomic crisis plaguing the world. And then my parents would have to try and find a way of breaking these down for us. And so I think breaking down ambition is kind of, it's very much like raising a child and encouraging children to behave in a proper way. And it comes with sort of carrots and sticks. And so we talk about ambition, and ambition is fantastic. Climate ambition is amazing, but it needs to be followed up by action. And it also needs some kind of framework that monitors and evaluates whether or not that action is actually working, or whether or not the child is actually putting in the work to behave properly. And that involves people to be able to say, oh, you know what, you're doing a fantastic job. This is working. This has demonstrated that you've been able to achieve X, Y, and Z. What it also needs is people to be able to punish inaction. And that's something that we've not been particularly good at. We have countries that have gone far too long under the radar, countries that are sitting in the Pacific Ocean, might I add, kind of some of the most coal-rich countries, finding ways of all sorts of loopholes to try and get around some of the agreements that they've made under the Paris Agreement. And these are things that we need to start getting away from. We need to find ways of ensuring that these people and these institutions and these countries, regardless of how wonderful they may be at face value or how much money they may be contributing to large systems like the United Nations, are being held accountable. And that's accountability, one of the most important things.
Is literally one of the most important things. And you're in my brain in a
Precisely.
way. That's the question that we all have, is how do we hold them accountable? And Mayor, you're in what we hope is a microcosm for what's possible globally. Can you talk a little bit about accountability and what you've learned in the process thus far of Transform Freetown, about infusing the system with accountability, especially for those institutions and individuals who aren't used to being held accountable?
Yes, so I think Transform Freetown, as other speakers have said, us is about the data, it's about the metrics. So the design of the initiative sets out these 4 clusters within which are 11 priority sectors, and then we landed on 19 specific targets, and we report back to the city every year on how money has been raised, where money has gone, and where we are in reaching those targets. Because of a dearth of data, we haven't been able to do numeric, quantitative reports on those percentages throughout, but we will in the final year, which is next year. But just on the so that accountability has built confidence. That accountability has encouraged other people to come on board, which is also why we've been very successful actually in mobilizing support.
Cheer for yourself. It's okay to say we're very successful.
No, I mean, when you think about where we started with a concept, and today we have partners, stakeholders in country, out of country, but perhaps our greatest partners are Freetonians themselves, and the fact that today we can be in an SDG zone at the UN and people talk about Transform Freetown means that it's worked, that it's become a concept which has caught people's imaginations, and accountability has been a big part of that. But I just wanted to come back to something that Ernest said just now. And we both are going to be broken records on this business of finance. We've talked about trickle down being, not really. But the other thing is that the data that I'm seeing says that 80% plus of the resources that are going into climate into climate change or climate change mitigation or adaptation are going into cities in the Western industrialized countries. So there's also this point that we can't get away from. You touched on it at the beginning, Nadira, which is the global South is facing the crisis and is most vulnerable to the crisis, least equipped financially to deal with the crisis. And we don't want to go into all the histories of colonialism and, you know, trade agreements and how it is that we got to be where we are.
But we certainly could.
We could, but we don't have
It's
enough time today. So at this point in time, what we're going to say is we leave no one behind. And COVID has taught us that if you think your borders can restrict you or save you from a crisis that is in somebody else's neighborhood, think again. It's going to be the same with climate. So we need to ensure that statistic of 80% plus going into certain parts of the world, the developed parts of the world, that changes for not just the sake of those in the global South, but for all of our sakes, because this has got to be a global solution, leaving no one behind. In the same way we talk about finance equity, you know, vaccine equity, let it not be like vaccine equity. Let it not be the thing we said wouldn't happen, that there wouldn't be inequity. There is inequity. We can't afford the same thing to happen with financing the climate crisis.
Absolutely. And in a lot of ways, this entire process has been a kind of dry run for what is coming at an even larger scale in the next few years, let alone the next few decades. So it's so important. I know we're almost out of time, but honestly, I could talk to you for the rest of the day. So I want your reflection on one sort of almost more theoretical thing, which is just that it is shocking to so many of us in this space that this is so hard, that we still open the newspaper and see words like the climate debate or the jury is still out. And yet we're all having the experiences that we're having right now. And we recognize that there's investment and there's commitment, but there isn't this sense of how dire the situation actually is. And I have to say some of that may be to your point, Yvonne, and the point everybody's made, that it's those folks in the developed world that are only now cottoning to what the effects are. But what do we do to get people to understand things you all know so intrinsically? Because I dare say, Ernest, we all grew up at tables like the one you're talking about, and that's why we're all here in this conversation. We had those families and those parents that talked to us that way. But for the folks who didn't, how do we get them on board so that they can actually engage in this movement? Because we need them. Ernest, go right ahead. You don't have to wait for me.
Sure. I was going to say, I think that's probably one of the hardest things, is trying to convince somebody of something that, or a reality that they have yet to experience. But I think one of the ways that we need to do it is by selling it as the climate crisis is not something to be debated or not a question to be answered. Actually, the question is, what are we going to do about it? And too much has been kind of focused on this debate of, is it happening? Is it not happening? In the same way that we've had the conversations about, is COVID happening? Is COVID not happening? Is the vaccine safe? Is the vaccine going to save us? And actually, what we should be talking about is kind of just completely acknowledging that it's happening and saying, this is what we're going to do about it. These are the systems that have led us to the situation that we're in. And then these are the ways in which we are going to continue to ensure that we, one, have a future that's available for our children, but also, I mean, that we're able to say, in the same way that Yvonne has been, so proudly talking about the initiatives that she's been able to champion in Freetown, that we can say the same thing about us, that we were faced by the biggest crisis that the world had ever seen. We stood up, we rose to the occasion, we fought, and we, did everything that we possibly could, and we won. I think that is the ultimate goal, right? And then we can now tell stories to our kids at the dining table 20, 30 years from now about something great, as opposed to, oh, by the way, we were really slack and we failed because we were lazy. And that was the beginning of
the end. But the data's already there. Yvonne, can I get you to just weigh in really quickly on that question of how we motivate people who don't want to be motivated, perhaps?
I think we just have to keep on doing the right thing. Human beings it takes a lot to change mindsets, but we've got to demonstrate, and actually, sadly, nature is going to do a lot of the work for us. It's already starting. And so we who are aware of what the answers are need to keep on showing that, demonstrating that, putting it into practice, sharing it through networks, and the rest will have to follow, not because necessarily they want to, but because climate change is real, it's here, and we're going to see more. There's no choice. I think what we need to also do, though, is demonstrate that there's hope. And that's why us doing the right thing is so important. We can't get to a situation where people just give up and feel like they can't influence. We can all influence, but our leaders must take the lead.
Absolutely. And now, just as we close out, 15 seconds from each of you on one call to action for our participants today, because you say we can all do something. What's the one thing that folks can do who are watching right now, the minute they sign off from the action zone today? Yvonne, why don't you start? And then Ernest, we'll go to you to close out.
I'm going to give you two things.
Ooh. I'll take it.
One is lobby your governments, wherever you are, lobby your governments to not just talk about this, but to do it and to stick to whatever they sign at COP. And two, plant a tree.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Ernest.
I also was going to do two, but my second was going to be plant a tree. So I think my first one.
This is collaboration in real time, you guys.
So I will just go with the one. I will just
take
go
us
with
out
the
with your one.
And it's call out bad behavior all the time, no matter who it is. Call out bad behavior, because I think there's no room now for people that are behaving in a subpar manner. And we cannot give currency to that kind of behavior.
And there is a cost to it, not just to all of us, but there should be a cost to the individual too. Thank you, thank you, thank you to Yvonne, to Ernest, to Gonzalo. Literally, this was an incredible conversation, and one that I know is going to turn into action. So we'll see you again in the SDG Action Zone, and goodbye for now.